Hi, welcome back to another episode of Coldstream Rod Shop. I'm Derek Fraser. In last week's video, we were working on the second 34 Ford chassis. I left the video off at a point where we had to figure out a problem of basically fitting the T5 transmission to this adapter. What I had thought at that point in time was we didn't get it right, that we would have to revert back to using a Y-block bell housing and then using the other adapter. What I didn't know was that a lot of these T5 transmissions, and I'm sure everybody's going to point that out to me in the last video, the input shaft actually has to be trimmed out about between 3/8 and 1/2 of an inch. So I took this little portion here off of the input shaft on the transmission and it bolted up just fine. And then when I looked up inside, I could see quite clearly that there was more than enough of the input shaft that would go into the throw-up bearing. So right now we've got that bolted in. I've just got to run and get a few more nuts and a few more bolts to attach this, and I'll be ready to kind of dummy it into the chassis. I do have to clean up the front here and put a water pump on it, so I'll kind of have the full length. On the front end, the 4 bars, we ordered the brand new urethane bushings from Welders Series to replace these old ones. They're on the way, so we're going to work on that. But one thing I realized looking at the video from last week, I didn't talk a whole lot about how we installed the parallel leaf springs on the back. I made mention of the fact that it came from Chassis Engineering, and it's a bolt-in kit. So there's the instructions there. It's relatively straightforward to put in as far as the bracketry goes. They give you the front brackets here and they give you the back brackets, and they basically point out a certain bolt that you would put it in. You would put the first bolt in and drill the other one. So there's 2 bolts on the side here, and then on the inside there's actually 2 bolts that come up from the bottom, which you have to drill. And then in the back, there's a similar situation where we've got 5 different bolts and a great big plate here that goes across. I forget which one was the locating hole, but there's a locating hole you go off of and basically drill the other holes out. Again, there's 5 bolts on the outside, and then again on the inside, there's, well, right there, there's 2 bolts that hold it in place. I think people got the gist of the video last week, but I just didn't go into too much detail about how it went in place. One thing, and I'm sure it's probably going to come up, is people will wonder if I'm going to weld it in place. So I've had that discussion with the owner as well. And I think what we're going to do is we're going to clean this up a little bit and put a couple tack welds in place just for an extra level of security. So what we'll do now, I'm going to carry on working on the Y-block, getting, like I said, the water pump on, getting ready to position it in. We'll start assembling the stuff on the front end, and then, like I said, hopefully those new bushings will come in and we'll get that whole front end completed. So I just looked at the video I just talked to you guys about, and I made mention that the input shaft went into the throw-up bearing. I'm sure everybody's going to watch the video and say, well, the input shaft actually goes into the pilot bearing in the back of the crank. So knew what I was talking about, just used the wrong words. as you can see from the 2 time lapses, I have the disc brakes all in place, and then I put the tie rod on and I adjusted the toe in. So the front end basically is set up right now. The final adjustment on the angle of the axle I'm still going to have to do because now the weight's on the car, but I'm waiting for the brand new bushings to come in for the 4 bars, which will be in early next week. So when I change the bushings on the 4 bars, I'll make that final adjustment, because now where I've set the engine in and put the weight on the front end, I know how much more I have to adjust the axle. Now, as I said, now I've got the engine and the transmission kind of dummied in here. I've got the radiator more or less in place. At the moment, I've got about 1.25 inch clearance between the snout of the water pump. I might move it back another 1/4 inch. I'm not sure just yet. Engine kind of is sitting plus or minus 1/2 inch forward or back of where it's going to be. But the conclusion I've now drawn is that that original transmission mount is going to have to come out, which is kind of what I suspected. We tried to avoid not taking it out. The owner would have liked to have keep it in here, but with the choice of transmission and engine, really have no choice right now because the transmission's sitting way too high. So the first step now is I'll take the radiator and engine out, take out that transmission mount, and I'll put the chassis engineering transmission mount that he supplied us in. We'll then put the engine back into this position, find the location for the transmission mount in the back, and then I can start playing around with where the front of the engine is going to be and where it's going to sit in the frame. We're going to have to set it so that the pinion or the angle of the drive line is going to match that of the rear end, which is around about 3 degrees. So gonna have to work our way through that. Now, one other complication has come into the mix here. The owner has supplied me with some their truck ram horn exhaust manifolds. So they're really cool. These are originals. They fit on here. They sit really wide, so he's either going to have a bulge in his hood or he's going to run no hood sides. However, the one complication now versus the way that we put the Y block in, the engine mount pretty much comes in line with where the exhaust manifold comes out. So what I'm going to have to do is I'll have the engine mounts here and then I'll shift it forward. So I'll actually make another engine mount that puts the insulator puck slightly forward. So that's another twist. So I'm going to carry on with that tomorrow. I'm going to rip the transmission mount out and we'll put the chassis engineering one in there. I'll show you over on the 32 here what I mean. As far as real estate goes, I'm not sure, hopefully the camera lady can come over here and see. If you can see here, the engine mount on the Y block, if you set it right in line with where it is, and then here's the oil filter. Not a lot of room there to run an exhaust pipe down through. So what we want to do is actually put this puck slightly forward and basically put a plate on the side here so that we'll have a gap for this exhaust manifold to go on like that, and then have the exhaust be able to come down in between the engine mount and the oil filter and still like have a gap around it, so you know you don't have too much heat there. So that's the next challenge. So follow along and see how we get there. So right now I've got the engine out and I have removed the original cross member here. Basically it was a matter of drilling out the rivets a few times, well actually grinding the tops of the rivets, then center punching them, drilling them out, and then basically beating the rivets out. Not really a whole lot of fun, took a little while to do, but it is out. And now we have the chassis engineering lower cross member in place. So there was only one hole, this one right there on either side, that you line it up with. The rest of the holes you've got to basically drill a 5/16 or a 3/8 hole depending on the size of nuts you have. In my case I use 3/8, so there's 3 across the bottom, and then across the back there's also nuts and bolts. So that's in place right now. The next step is this mock cross member here. I've got to modify that because I've determined that the engine, when it rests on that bar, has got to sit about 2 inches lower. So what I want to do is modify that bracket so that when I put the engine in and the transmission, it's going to approximately sit at that 3-degree angle. And then I'll go about starting to build the engine mounts. So modify that next, and then we'll dummy the engine back in and see where we sit. So here's attempt number 1. I Z'd, I guess, that front bracket so it dropped down about 2.5 inches. Give myself a little more room for adjustment. And then in the back, the T5 transmission, that's as far back as it'll go. So what it, oh, right there. So what it looks like is that the mount is coming up against this bracket. So what I'm going to have to do now is I am going to have to probably get my plasma cutter out and cut this piece off here. Potentially we will do something to reinforce it on the other side, but for now, just for clearance's sake, and in order to get the engine transmission in, I need to cut that away because basically the engine needs to go at least 1 inch forward. So that oil pan, as you can see right down there, should line up with the cross member from my last measurement. So we're going to pull her back out, make that modification, and go with round number 2. Well, I'm going to take 2.95 degrees. That's about as close to 3 degrees as we're going to get. I had to take the transmission and the engine out a couple times because in the back here, this webbing on the back of the T5, I had to cut the bracket out several times. You can see the bits and pieces on the floor. And then right now that mount kind of hangs over the edge here. What I'm probably going to do is add like a little bit of a gusset around the back of here. There still is a significant amount of material around the bolt hole, so not really worried about it too much, but I think what I'll do, I'm just going to put a little bit around that just because. So right now with the engine sitting in there like that, it's centered. I can begin to start making the engine mounts. Well, that's it. Anyways, we'll carry on with the engine mounts and hopefully get this in there permanently. So before I made the engine mounts, I decided to put the cowl and the radiator in place, and it looks as though we're going to have to move the engine forward some more and potentially move it up about 1 inch. The ultimate goal is to try and have the engine sit as close to the firewall without modifying it, but it kind of looks as though that's not going to be the case, because at the moment we have basically 2 inches clearance between the snout and the radiator, and then down here, that is the forward body mount that the firewall right there would attach to. So the firewall actually has to come forward 2 inches. So I think the best compromise that we're going to work on here is to move the engine. We have to move it up about 1 inch so we clear that front original cross member, and then move the engine forward probably 1.75 inches. That way we'll minimize the amount that we have to put an indentation in the firewall. The owner is planning on using an electric fan. I was talking to him, so going to take everything apart again. Go and drill another hole in the back of the transmission mount here, put it 1.75 inches forward, and then put a 1 inch spacer underneath it. And then what I will do is my little dummy engine cradle right there, I'll put a 1 inch piece of metal underneath that, and we'll put it back together again. And so just in a couple seconds, you will see the next iteration. So we got the Y block in. I've moved it forward as far as I can. We currently have about 3/8 of an inch clearance between the front, I guess the front pulley here and the radiator. And then we're basically touching up against the firewall, which is kind of what I was asked to do. So I've moved it a full 2 inches forward from where we were before. We are sitting level. And I did have to come up, I think, about 1.25 inches in order to position it where it is. So that allows for clearance for this oil pan. That's the passenger oil pan. But as I said, I think I said earlier, we're going to be putting a truck oil pan or a Thunderbird oil pan in, which is similar to what we have over here on the Roadster. So you get more clearance across the front. The brackets here, I was able to shift them I think 1 7/8 forward from where the center line of the engine mount is on the block to where the engine mount is here on the frame. Now, right now, the lower engine mounts are not welded in. I'm waiting for the customer to come back up and give us the final okay for where it is, because what he wanted, he does not want, he wants the minimum amount of modification to the firewall that he can. Now, what we're thinking also as well is this is an original radiator. It's, I think, about 3 inches thick. The aftermarket ones are around 2 1/4. So we're going to pick up a little more space here for the pulley. The other thing he's looking into is there's a possibility that there's another timing chain cover that's a little shorter. He says he has one, so going to look at that as well. But we kind of want to keep the engine really right here where it's at. Over on the other side, the request was to shift those engine mounts forward to where they connected to the frame versus where they were on the block, so that we would allow, he could use these ram horn style exhaust manifolds. So right now I can put my fist there between this massive early oil filter and the engine mount. So obviously he's going to be using a later engine with a smaller diameter oil filter, so we're going to have even more clearance here. But right now I could put my fist between there, and with a 2-inch exhaust we got plenty of room to go down there, have clearance from the rubber biscuit and have clearance from the oil filter. So I think I've got the engine where he wants it. So we won't be able to tell you if that's the final place in this particular video, because I have to wait for him to come up and kind of give the final go-ahead onto it. In the back here, the transmission mount, I had drilled the extra hole. If it stays where it's at, we're going to put the reinforcing back here that I cut out from the original place, because originally we were sitting about 2 inches further back. I had to cut this out. If it stays where it's at, we'll put the reinforcing back in. This top piece currently doesn't fit, but what I'm ultimately going to do is, if that's where the engine and transmission are staying, I'll notch this out and I'll put this on as well. So anyways, that's as far as we can get this week with the 34 chassis and the Y-block engine and transmission. There's still more to do to finish this off before we hand it back to the customer. That's it for this week. Please like, share, tag, and subscribe. Please send us your comments and tell us what you think about what we're doing with the engine, how close it is to the firewall and the radiator. Anyways, check back with us next week and we're going to carry on with this. Everybody take care and have a great week.